Hi, Barely Sapient here. Today I'm going to tell you why I've been switching over to Linux and away from Windows the past year. And it's been partly gradual, but at the moment, I don't even like booting Windows at all. Now, I've been a PC gamer since 1993. That was the year I got my first computer, and that was a 486. And the dominant gaming operating system on PC then was DOS. So that was before Windows. Now I think we're coming to a point where Windows might actually start losing its dominance in the PC gaming market. But that's another discussion. Now, I am somebody that doesn't play very many multiplayer online games, so the switch has been fairly easy for me. That was right now is the one thing that really is challenging uh, when switching over to Linux these days is multiplayer online games that use some sort of anti-cheat. So your Battlefield 6s and Valorants just won't work in Linux. But single player games, largely not a problem. I use Linux Mint for my main system, and I also have it's set up as a dual boot, so I can boot into Windows 11. Generally speaking, or especially for single player games, the performance in Linux Mint is as good or better, sometimes a little worse, but overall it's at least as good. And because Windows, the way they have it set up nowadays, it's always constantly forcing ads on you, spying on you, and generally disrespecting your privacy as a user. And that is why I have switched to Linux on top of the other things. For a long time there, Windows was a dominant gaming operating system because games just wouldn't, the great majority of games just would not work on other operating systems. Well, that's not the case anymore. And good riddance. Now, my main system is an AMD Ryzen 5900X with an AMD Radeon Rx 6950 XT, and I have 64 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM. So it's fairly newer hardware, and basically on hardware that's about 5 years old or newer, running most games, as long as they're single player and don't use anti-cheat, is almost indistinguishable from running the game in Windows. Very few and far between are there games that just don't run. Most of the time they just work, in my experience. This year especially, it seems, Windows updates seem to be breaking something, whether it be SSDs or the recovery environment, not letting you use USB devices in the recovery environment if something goes wrong, or just something else. And for me specifically this week, when I went to go plug in my USB capture tool or device, um, before I did so, I did the right thing. You're supposed to update your graphics drivers and stuff like that for security and performance reasons, right? Well, yeah, the capture card crashed the AMD GPU driver in Windows. And Windows just seems to be getting more and more bugs lately. And I'm not the only one to notice. Because of Valve's support for Linux, and because of game launchers like Heroic Games Launcher, Windows isn't the only operating system in town for gaming anymore. And thank goodness for that. So basically what I've done is benchmarked 5 games that I'm currently playing on both operating systems. Now, these are not fresh installs. These are just living, breathing operating systems that I've been using for the past about a year. And only one of them performs better in Windows 11. And Linux just doesn't have the baggage that Windows does. First game on the list is Atomfall, and in Windows, this actually performed better. This is the game that performed better out of the five that I've been playing lately, and it had an average of 130.6 frames per second, a 1% low of 100.7 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 87.2 frames per second. And this was at 1080p with all settings maxed out except anti-aliasing, which was set to medium. In Linux Mint, I had an average frame rate of 124.2 frames per second, a 1% low of 83.4 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 18.8 frames per second. So the 1% and 0.1% lows, especially 0.1% lows, are a lot worse off in Linux. Next up is Cyberpunk 2077. In Windows, the average frame rate was 66.7 frames per second. The 1% low was 46.2 frames per second, and the 0.1% low was 34.9 frames per second. In Linux Mint, the average frame rate was 63.6 frames per second. The 1% low was 47.5 frames per second, and the 0.1% low was 36.8 frames per second. So the zero point 0.1 and 1% lows were slightly higher in Linux. The average was slightly lower, so I'll give this basically a tie. There's no distinguishable difference between the two if you're playing, unless you're looking at an overlay showing your frame rates. In Cyberpunk 2077, the in-game benchmark will always give you higher numbers than actual gameplay. But anyways, for both operating systems, I used the Ray Tracing Ultra preset and 1080p resolution. I didn't change any settings. Next up is Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced Edition, and this was at the high RT graphics preset, and the resolution is at 1080p. In Windows, the average frame rate was 137.6 frames per second. The 1% low was 57.4 frames per second. The 0.1% low was 49.3 frames per second. In Linux Mint, the average was slightly higher, but functionally absolutely the same, 137.9 frames per second. However, the 1% low was a lot higher at 71.3 frames per second, and the 0.1% low was a little bit higher at 53.5 frames per second. Now, if I wasn't looking at the graphics overlay, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference in performance playing between Windows 11 Pro and Linux Mint. But the performance is better in Linux Mint. Next up is Star Wars Jedi Survivor. I set the graphics preset to Epic, and ray tracing is on, and the resolution is at 1080p. Now in Windows, I got a frame rate of 52.8 frames per second, a 1% low of 34.3 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 5.7 frames per second. So with ray tracing on in Windows, it is definitely struggling with ray tracing. In Linux Mint, I was able to average 67.1 frames per second, and I had a 1% low of 42.1 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 30.1 frames per second at the same setting. So it actually performs a lot better in Mint. The last game that I tested both operating systems in was Oblivion Remaster. This was at 1080p high with software lumen turned to low. And in Windows, I got a frame rate of 61.9 frames per second, a 1% low of 15.5 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 4.3 frames per second. And this was with picking a fight with the guards. And I also, in Linux, did the exact same thing. I had an average of 73.9 frames per second, a 1% low of 41.7 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 13.7 frames per second. So the 1% and 0.1% lows are considerably higher in Linux Mint. God of War is another game that I'm playing through the single player campaign. And the thing about this game is I have not bothered to install it on Windows. And here's why. This footage here is me playing against the first boss. And I decided to benchmark it. And my settings are basically 4K at 75% resolution scaling with all other settings turned to their respective maximums. Now I do have VSync turned on, so it's trying to limit the frame rate to 60 frames per second, and boy does it ever do a great job at these settings. The average is 59.9 frames per second. The 1% low is 55.9 frames per second, and the 0.1% low is functionally the same, also 55.9 frames per second. It's buttery smooth when playing this, and as you can see the frame time graph, it doesn't even look like it's moving. Why would I bother with Windows when I can get performance like this in Linux Mint without all the baggage? It seems like with Windows, there's always an update threatening to break something. Uh, every feature update or major update, you have to turn off settings that were there to basically spy on you. Microsoft is always trying to get you to use Bing. It's always trying to get you to sign on with your Microsoft account. I mean, it's just not very user friendly anymore in that regard. I don't have to deal with any of that with Linux. So, I mean, that's why I don't use Windows anymore as my daily driver. This is Horizon Zero Dawn at 1440p at the highest possible settings and Linux Mint. And I have also not installed this game on Windows because, well, performance is like this. It's at 120 frames per second. I have VSync turned on, and the frame graph is a straight line. Why would I even bother with Windows at this point? On top of Linux Mint performing as well or better most of the time than Windows 11, I've also had various crashes in Windows in certain games. Most notably, Jedi Survivor, Cyberpunk 2077, and Oblivion Remaster have all crashed on me at various times while trying to play them in Windows 11. I've not had those same issues in Linux Mint. So stability has been better for me in Linux. Windows just seems to be becoming more and more of a pain to use. That's why I switched to Linux. This next week I will not be putting out a video as I am moving. Hopefully I'll see you guys 2 weeks from now. Until then, have a great day and happy gaming. Like and subscribe if you like the video, and comments are always welcome.